In this video, it's a Super NES Encyclopedia Showdown. Which of these books is the best at covering all the 16-bit Nintendo games? Let's find out. Hi everyone, John here. This is a super special book review, as unlike other videos focusing on individual books, now these books will be put up against each other in a super showdown. Before we get into this literary street fight, please mash that subscribe button and combo it with that notification bell so you can get the first attack bonus on my videos as they roll out. If you've been watching or are subscribed to my channel, you know that earlier I've reviewed some books dedicated to looking at the games of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. As promised, I wanted to compare them side by side and back to back and bit to bit, including and especially focusing on details not covered in the original reviews. When put against each other, is there a clear winner? Let's find out. Here are your challengers. Jeffrey Hagen's The Complete SNES Collector's Book and Ultimate Guide from Hagen's Alley Books. Comes in both the Heavyweight Definitive Edition and the Featherweight Pocket Edition. Brett Weiss's The SNES Omnibus, a tag team of books by Schiffer Publishing. The Super Nintendo Anthology, a 1-2 punch from Geeks-Line Publishing. And Pat Contre's Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library, 1991 to 1998 from Country Code Productions. Despite the Super NES being about 30 years old, all of these books were published in a tight time frame of 2018 and 2019. Whether these close releases are coordinated, competing, or coincidental, they are still quite welcome for fans of this era of Nintendo games. Also a coincidence is that we don't seem to have single volumes for any of these publications. Each exists in multiple parts or have multiple versions. For Jeffrey Hagen's The Complete SNES, we have the Definitive Edition and the Pocket Edition. The Definitive Edition replaces the first version of this book, which I don't have on hand, but that claimed to be the first comprehensive book on the subject, though this is now obsoleted by this. And then the Complete SNES Pocket Edition just covers the North American Super NES games, so that part is most identical, but has none of the games exclusive to other regions, or any supplementary material, and reduced to this size, it is meant for collectors on the go. Because of their similarities and differences, when I compare the Complete SNES to all the other books, depending on what the focus is, I will either list these books together or separately. The SNES Omnibus is in 2 volumes for a different reason. It's a lot to put into just one book. Each game gets a minimum of 1 page, and besides some text and screenshots, many feature ads and similar materials, so this coverage has to be split into 2. The first volume says it covers games with titles beginning with A to M, though it also has those 2 games that begin with a number. Naturally, the second volume covers the games beginning with N to Z. The Super Nintendo Anthology, in its Ultimate Edition form, keeps its 2 books in a slipcase. The software book, which consists of only game reviews, is the one that is most comparable to the other books in this video. The hardware book talks about, well, the Super NES hardware, including its technical specs and accessories, as well as its origins and history. It also features other things related to the Super NES, including developer interviews and a look at box art and advertising. Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library, 1991 to 1998, keeps all of its reviews within a single large volume. However, its multiplicity lies in its cover options. You can have one with a North American version of the Super NES on the cover, or perhaps you prefer the European one. Also, 500 copies have a special edition cover, though the content in all versions of this book are the same. This book also has a digital version. Speaking of covers, here's the first thing we can compare side by side, the covers. They say we can't judge a book by its cover, but we can certainly judge the covers themselves. I didn't really talk about these in the individual reviews, so we might as well do that now. I will list them in order from my least to most favorite cover. First off, and worst off, is the cover for the Complete SNES Definitive Edition. There appear to be different artists with different styles, and if not the art, then the arrangement of them on this gray gradient comes off as a little amateurish compared to the others. Sorry. If we need a positive here, it's better than the grotesquely muscular eject button from the original edition, in my opinion. Regardless of my stance on grotesque muscles, having what seems to be an original character that seems so in your face seems to be an odd way to present the Super NES. The covers of the SNES Omnibus are basic, but maybe too much, as these are a little boring. Here we have the Super NES controller, with the title where the Super Nintendo Entertainment System logo would normally be. The title on the controller is redundant, especially considering the only other thing on the cover is the title again at the top. In some cases I do like a minimalist aesthetic, and it is tidy and clean, and in this case matches the similarly styled inside of the books. but whatever sharpness it may have is dulled with both volumes bearing the exact same cover, just a change in the color of the title. I like consistency, especially when it comes to form and function. And yes, I see that these match the NES books in the same series, but when compared to the other books, this cover does not elicit much excitement. And these are books about the Super NES, which should be exciting, for crying out loud. At least they have some game boxes on the back, clarifying that this is a book about games. Surprisingly lacking on the covers of most other books. So that's something, though more on the practical side, and not really creative in their arrangement. The Super Nintendo Anthology's cover fares a little better with a somewhat artistic render of both the Super NES and the Super Famicom. Its black cover gives it a sense of luxury, and the Japanese title does make it seem more worldly, fitting since it features all the Japanese games, even though this version of the book is entirely in English. One thing that does irk me is that the title and spine appears to be upside down. Now I did say that in some cases, the two books of the complete SNES would be looked at separately, and this is one such situation. There are a number of fixes between the definitive edition and the pocket edition, and I would consider the new cover to be a fix. The art is better, and it doesn't look like it was just mashed together from different sources. Though I legitimately like Smartball, Jerry the Blob is a funny inclusion among all these more popular heroes, and I don't think Lena from Super Valis 4 is as well known as everybody else here either. But it is funny to see that she is dressed just like Chrono from Chrono Trigger, who she is next to. A great drawing of generally representative characters, and this pocket edition of the complete SNES is leagues above the definitive edition cover and the cover of the original book. That one and the best one share an angled purple grid, and it's a really close match between them. I might just have to give the edge to Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library. Just looking at this cover, you actually know what it's about. All of these books review games, yet this is the only one to show any cartridges on the front cover at all. Besides the 7 games, there are 20 screenshots on the cover. Is Country Code Productions allowed to use the Nintendo Racetrack logo? As mentioned, there are multiple covers for this book, but they share the same overall design, so they all earn top honors here. If I could improve something, I would have put something in the somewhat empty middle here, where Rob is in the NES book of this series, though I'm not sure what. The Super Scope maybe? It isn't used in many games, but definitely more than Rob is, though I guess you can see more of the screenshots. In any case, out of these 5 that I have here, this has the best cover in my opinion. An interesting thing is that I asked my brother Jason to also put the books in order of what he thinks are the least to most appealing cover, with no more information than that. He hasn't read any of these books, and yet, in under a minute, he came up with the exact same order that I did. So, how about you? Do you agree or disagree? Am I just a harsh art critic? Enough about covers. Let's talk about coverage, as in, what games do each book cover? All of them claim to look at every game, but that doesn't actually mean they have the same number of reviews. Obviously, one thing to consider is what geographical regions are included. If it's just North and South America, there should be 721 games. If it's the whole world, it's literally just over 1,000 more games. So the range is quite large. Then tweaking the numbers slightly, or whether or not reskins or re-releases or compilations get separate entries. Then there are special competition cartridges. There are unofficial games that may or may not be featured, most notably Super Noah's Ark 3D, also known as Super 3D Noah's Ark. Star Fox 2 is another odd case, which we'll get into later. So let's break it all down to a numbers game. Here they are from having the fewest to the most reviews. The Super NES Omnibus has the fewest games reviewed at 722, with 359 in the first volume and 363 in the second. It only looks at American games, but this 722 doesn't actually include all 721 official games. This is erroneously missing International Superstar Soccer and International Superstar Soccer Deluxe. It also excludes Super Copa, which might at least be explained by it being a South American release. Despite missing 3 games, coincidentally all soccer games, the SNES Omnibus has 4 extra games, including the 2 competition cartridges, as in Donkey Kong Country Blockbuster World Video Game Championship 2, and Star Fox Super Weekend. Speaking of Star Fox, the cancelled sequel is in here as well. Star Fox 2 was originally scrapped, and even though reproductions of prototype versions can be found, a legitimate release wouldn't happen until 2017 Super NES Classic Edition. It is an interesting addition because it appears in some of these books, which probably wouldn't have happened if these books came out a few years earlier, before the Super NES Classic Edition was announced in 2017. I personally don't think Star Fox 2 belongs in the main section of any book, since it wasn't released for the original hardware, outside of unofficial reproduction cards. And lastly, this book includes the unofficial Super Noah's Ark 3D. So that's the SNES Omnibus, with 722 when you have both volumes. Next up is the complete SNES Pocket Edition, which also has 722, but ranks higher for not missing those soccer games. It has the official 721 games, plus Super Noah's Ark 3D. So if you only care about American releases you would have expected to find in the store in the 1990s, no competition cartridges or anything else unusual, then this is as simple as it gets. Now the numbers are going to vary once we open up to the rest of the world. Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library has 783 main reviews, but counting the smaller reviews can be up to 887. Firstly, it has 721 American games, including Super 3D Noah's Ark, and this is the only book that calls it this instead of Super Noah's Ark 3D. Also, unlike other books, the Miracle Piano Teaching System isn't reviewed in the main section, but it comes up later. Okay, here, take it back. Ugh. There are 62 games for PAL territories, which include Europe and Australia. Now to clarify, there are certainly more than 62 Super NES games in Europe. It's just that in all these books with multiple regions, if an American version exists, it takes priority, and here the European title would be listed underneath the American title where they share the same review. So the 62 I'm referring to are considered European exclusives, or European/Japanese releases. And the number 62 is contested because of, once again, soccer games. You see, Europe first got Sensible Soccer European Champions, then America got Championship Soccer 94, which is essentially the same game. But then it was released back again in Europe as Sensible Soccer International Edition. While reskins within the same regions do get their own reviews, like Cannondale Cup and Exertainment Mountain Bike Rally, regional variations do not, which is why we have the American Contra 3 The Alien Wars, but not a separate entry for the European Super Probotector Alien Rebels. But unusual in the case of Sensible Soccer is that the American version actually came after the first European version, but in this book the American versions always get priority. So should there be 1, 2, or 3 reviews here? There is an explanation in the reflection section confirming that even the writer sees these games as identical other than the teams, but doesn't have all the answers. So this book chose to have 2 reviews here, one for the original Sensible Soccer European Champions, and then Championship Soccer 94 for America with Sensible Soccer International Edition listed as the alternate version of that. But you can see how this can easily be treated differently depending on who's putting together a book. Anyway, that's 783 main reviews altogether. You can also consider this as having 887 reviews if you include the very brief looks at 104 other cartridges. This total includes 9 special or promo cartridges, and the Miracle Piano Teaching Systems here, 5 test cartridges, a selection of 58 Japanese Super Famicom games, yet only a tiny glimpse at each, and 32 unreleased games. And this is where you would find Star Fox 2 in this book. So, this is the Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library. 783 meaty reviews, or looks at 887 total cartridges. We have the complete SNES Definitive Edition now, with 1,199 game reviews, or over 1,200 if you count everything that it mentions. No issues with the American games, as they're the same as in the Pocket Edition, so that's 722, once again including Super Noah's Ark 3D. There are 64 European exclusive games listed here in their own section. So that's the base 61 plus Sensible Soccer European Champions, just like with Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library, but this time Sensible Soccer International Edition, listed here not by its in-game name, but by the box name International Sensible Soccer World Champions, because sure, why not make this more confusing? Now also gets its own entry. And then World Cup Striker is added, despite being a version of Elite Soccer, which is what Americans got and already reviewed. The book justifies it by saying there are added features. Whatever the case, this could be seen as having 3 extra soccer games, which are different games than the 3 soccer games that the SNES Omnibus is missing, and I don't really know what to make of that. Maybe just a coincidence, but the next time you're cataloging your game collection and find a discrepancy in your count, maybe check the soccer games first. Or the football games, if you prefer. Then there are a whopping 336 reviews for Super Famicom games. It's still only a fraction of all of the Japanese games, a bit more than a third. But this selection is much larger than the 58 in Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library. Following that are 28 unreleased games, including Star Fox 2, and 48 homebrew cartridges, though that includes 3 flashcards. Early on in the book in the accessories section is a review of the Super Game Boy, in the same format as the game reviews, so counting all that, there are 1,199 reviews. Aside from these, the book also dedicates space to talk about the 2 competition cartridges, so maybe I should count those. But then it briefly goes over the 3 Max games and numerous test cartridges in general, so I don't know whether or even how to count those. Like, What should I do about the checklist of games for the Nintendo Super System arcade cabinet that doesn't even seem sure of itself? I don't know if any of that counts, but if so, that puts it over 1200. Now, I didn't go through the Japanese section with a fine-tooth comb, but I noticed there was a review of Harapiko Baka, which is redundant as it is the same as Hungry Dinosaurs, which was already reviewed in the European exclusive section. Also, though it is a trickier situation, the Japanese game Yokai Buster Ruka no Daiboken is a considerable reskin of the North American game The Jetsons Invasion of the Planet Pirates, not just changing the main character but the whole setting, yet the gameplay is the same, and this is the only book that fully addresses this by giving them distinct entries, as even the Super Nintendo Anthology only barely acknowledges this. But is this one game or two? So depending on how many redundancies and oddities there are, the actual number of distinct games might be different. Still, for comparison's sake, whatever the exact number it is, it still has the second most number of entries. Among these books, the software book of the Super Nintendo Anthology easily features the most games, as it fully covers all regions. There are 1,759 main reviews, though it actually covers many more cartridges. As mentioned in the original review, it's focused on software, not physical cartridges, meaning that reskins or bundles don't get another entry, as that would be redundant, at least gameplay-wise, though you would miss out on the box art. So here are 716 American reviews, the number I'll use here for consistency, but they do cover all 721 games. Firstly, it has 6 fewer entries because of reskins such as Cannondale Cup, Chave, Chave 2, Super Copa, and the bundles Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World, and Exertainment Mountain Bike Rally, and Speed Racer My Most Dangerous Adventures. Then it has one more entry, as it does include Star Fox 2. Unlike other books, Super Noah's Ark 3D is not reviewed here alongside the official games, though it will get a mention later on in the book. There are 61 European games, nice and simple, no reskins. Then there are a whopping 981 Japanese Super Famicom games, which takes up the majority of the reviews.
Are you ready for some real excitement? Final Fantasy 2.
Now, this book has 2 separate write-ups for Final Fantasy 2 and 4. If you didn't know, the numbering of the Final Fantasy games was unsynchronized here, since Final Fantasy 2, 3, and 5 were not originally released outside of Japan until later, so 4 was localized in the West as 2, and 6 as 3. While it should be a case of a different name and some other tweaks, just like so many other localized games, this book instead counts 2 and 4 as separate. But if you read the entry for 2, it really talks about the re-release of 4 in Japan known as Easy Type, which is actually easier than the American version. So it's another case of counting this as 1, 2, or 3 games, depending on how you look at it. But since this book otherwise counts different versions of the same game in all other cases as 1, this is still a unique situation. This book also reviews the cancelled Super NES version of Barbie Vacation Adventure within the main section by mistake. Then there is a dedicated section for cancelled games, the most ever with 94, and while they don't have the same format as the main reviews, many of them do have a screenshot and a similar amount of text, so I might as well count them too, and the same could be said about the 9 unlicensed games at the end of the software book. So counting all of that, that's 1,862 write-ups in total, and again, the actual number of cartridges covered is higher considering the reskins and bundles. I also mentioned that Dai 3Jai Super Robot Taisen mistakenly reprints the review meant for Daibakusho Gensi Gekijo, so technically that's not reviewed, so the number would actually be 1,861. But even with all the hair splitting we can do with the counts, the Super Nintendo Anthology still has over 50% more entries than the book with the second most, the complete SNES Definitive Edition, so the Super Nintendo Anthology easily takes the crown in the category of having the most reviews. Here's a fun fact I wasn't sure where else to mention it. The Game Boy cartridge of Space Invaders has a 16-bit version inside that is unlocked by using a Super Game Boy adapter. This isn't just a Game Boy game with Super Game Boy enhancements like a fancy color palette and a border. This is an actual 16-bit full-screen console version. The existence of the almost identical Space Invaders game on a normal Super NES cartridge probably made it easy to forget. While it might be fitting to mention in a Game Boy book, I feel that requiring a Super Game Boy and a Super NES would also warrant a mention somewhere in any of these Super NES books, but it doesn't show up even as a curious side note in any of them. The SNES Omnibus does mention the Game Boy game very briefly, but nothing about utilizing the Super Game Boy in this case. I feel like this would have been a good bonus point, but nope, no book earns this. Anyway, strictly based on the number of games featured, this ranking is easy. The most is the best. at least if you just want to be able to briefly refer to or count each game. If you actually want to look in depth at each one, that's where the next factor comes in. Review sizes. Are you getting a sentence, a blurb, or a wall of text? Let's start with the complete SNES. The Pocket Edition, which only features American games, has exactly the same text as in the Definitive Edition, save for the occasional corrections of things like capitalization errors that I mentioned in my original review for the full book. The Definitive Edition has European exclusives and selected Japanese games, as discussed earlier, but note that every single game, regardless of popularity or region, gets about the same size review, of about 3 to 6 sentences. Want to read about a great platformer like Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island? It's 6 sentences. Want to read about a crappy movie tie-in game like Beethoven? It's also 6 sentences. The Japanese Super Famicom games have mostly vertically oriented boxes, so there are 3 reviews per page instead of 2 for the American and European games. But even with this formatting change, the write-ups are the same size due to slightly smaller text. So while not meaty, the Definitive Edition is your best bet for Japanese reviews as long as you don't need every Super Famicom game, though the Pocket Edition, for American games only, might actually fit in your pocket. If you want all reviews to be the same length, then this is as fair as it gets, but these are all just blurbs. At least the box art is larger than in the other books, and though there's just a single screenshot, you don't have to squint to make out what it shows. Now let's look at the software book of the Super Nintendo Anthology. What happens when you have 1,759 main reviews but have to fit them in 352 pages? It averages literally just shy of 5 reviews per page on average. 64 games get a full page treatment, which is a good amount, and we'll talk more about those later. But 235 of the 352 pages, just a smidge over 2/3 of all pages, have 5 to 8 reviews. The numbers are reflective of what should be obvious to see, and that is that not a lot is written about most games since there are so many. When you read only about 3 sentences for many games, how much are you really learning about them? In these cases, I think the blurb on the back of the box would probably be more informative. No doubt there was clearly ambition to write about every single Super NES and Super Famicom game ever, and that should be applauded. But the book should have been at least twice as big to accommodate decent bite-sized reviews at minimum. Even putting aside the many mahjong, shogi, and pachinko games, there are still many Japanese games, not found in any other books being compared here, that I would like to know more about. I would often read entire pages and not feel like I learned anything about any of the games. But that's for the average reviews. This book has quite the range in its review sizes. As mentioned, 64 games do get a full page, and a few dozen get at least half a page. So if you like to read about popular games, you're probably in luck. But then you want to read about some slightly underrated games like Shadowrun, and then you get a description of only 2 sentences. That doesn't really do it justice. I love Geeks-Line Publishing's other anthology books for the Nintendo 64 and the GameCube, whose smaller libraries allowed for better sized entries, but the average review sizes for Super Nintendo Anthology are often too short. The SNES Omnibus keeps things simple, with no fractional pages here. Every game gets a minimum of 1 whole page, and 96 get 2 pages. That is definitely an improvement. For the most part, these are more proper looks, describing actual gameplay details thoroughly, often listing some stages and characters. But occasionally, you do get some reviews that don't really take up the whole page, like Bassmaster's Classic, with the amount of text only incrementally larger than previous books, as here it has 9 sentences, or Desert Strike with 5 sentences. Longer sentences, mind you, but if not for the insider insight, this would be lacking. Speaking of which, the memories, insider insights, and notable quotables help to add some text. With more variable formatting, the space is filled with multiple screenshots and other images, usually print ads found in game magazines at the time. Of course, these images are neat, but if we were just talking about review length, we're finally at something that is usually more than just a blurb. It can be a lot, but it's not always a wall of text though. However, Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library has this category covered by far, at least for the American and European games. If you want to know about Japanese games, this wouldn't be the book for you, as its selected games get the least amount of text ever, and are not really reviews. But otherwise, boom! Walls of text everywhere! Their reviews, including the reflections, always total quite close to 400 words, which are, on average, longer than reviews in the other books. Half a page is dedicated to each game, or a whole page for only a small few, and we'll talk about how each book handles favorites later. And you get all this to read, plus some reflections on each one. Even though my original review video about this book didn't like how it didn't find certain iconic games to be worthy of a full page, a half-page review here is still a more than decent length. Now, to get a better idea of how the lengths of the reviews compare, let's count the words in the entries for randomly selected games. None of these games are considered favorites by any book. More on that soon. As just stated, you can see that Ultimate Nintendo has reviews, including its reflections, of very close to 400 words, with very little variance across all games other than the favorites. Ultimate Nintendo's reviews are usually the longest reviews across all books, but not always, as in this sample we see that Super Ninja Boy, a fan of word counts ending in 99, has a much longer review of 599 words in the SNES Omnibus if you include all of its notable quotables. The SNES Omnibus has lots of size fluctuation, it seems. We see here Dragon View gets 209 words, or 124 for EVO, without the notable quotables. Games get more or less coverage depending on the book. As we just mentioned, Super Ninja Boy has the largest review in this sample at 599 words in the SNES Omnibus, but it also has the smallest, with only 41 words in the Super Nintendo Anthology. So again, this is a small sample, but it seems to confirm with what appears to be the case overall. On average, from shortest to longest, they go the complete SNES, Super Nintendo Anthology, the SNES Omnibus, and then Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library. The two that are on the extreme ends, the complete SNES and Ultimate Nintendo, are more consistent with the review lengths across all games. But the two in the middle, Super Nintendo Anthology and the SNES Omnibus, have a wider range of review sizes, and they do occasionally have shorter and longer reviews than the other books. Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library is the book to have if you like words and words and more words, though inversely, the two books with the otherwise smallest reviews, the complete SNES Definitive Edition, not Pocket, and the Super Nintendo Anthology, would actually both be much better choices for reviews of Japanese games. Since I had mentioned favorite games, let's take a look at how the books recognize them, in their opinion. There are hundreds of Super NES games, and there's no way they could all be equal. Some are considered iconic, classics, highlights, and standouts, or simply favorites. Every one of these favor the popular and timeless games in some way, or at least the ones that they think are so, which I've taken the time to track on a spreadsheet. While there are a few games that appear on everyone's lists, outside of those, the opinions differ, and the number of games that each choose to recognize, above and beyond simply a high score, also varies. 3 of these dedicate more space for longer reviews of the games they think are the best. The Super Nintendo Anthology has many short reviews, but the reviews can be of any size, with better games taking up more space on a page. For the purposes of this, I'll just look at the ones that get a whole page, of which there are 64, including 52 North American favorites, or 2 more if you count European exclusives, and another 10 for Japan. Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library is very obvious about this, with all reviews taking up half a page, except for 11 games, each getting a full page. The SNES Omnibus has 1 page minimum for every game already, so I've tracked all the games that get 2 pages, of which there are 96. With a heavy emphasis on reprinting ads and similar materials for many games here, I'm not sure if Brett Weiss truly means to indicate these 2-page games as necessarily favorites, but let's just run with it for the sake of comparison. Now the 2 versions of the complete SNES insist on equal size reviews, so it instead indicates preferences with an image of a heart. Pretty clear here, right? The complete SNES Definitive Edition has 55 of these, but as mentioned, the Pocket Edition made a number of fixes, including granting a heart to many games that were originally missing them, bringing the total of favorites to a whopping 171. For a version of a book already claiming to be definitive, this seems extreme, and tripling the favorites now also means that a quarter of the games are recommended, so that seems a bit high, and almost defeats the purpose of favoriting. After all, if there are so many favorites, what are really the favorites? It's like if you highlight everything, then nothing stands out. 103 out of the 171 selections marked with a heart are not favored by the other 3 books. So what games are seen as super special by all of the books? Absolutely unsurprisingly, we have the trinity of Super Mario World, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, and Super Metroid. The other 3 that have universal acclaim, or at least among these books, are Super Castlevania 4, Chrono Trigger, and Earthbound. If we consider the complete SNES Pocket Edition as replacing the definitive edition, including overwriting its non-Pixar favorites, then there is a seventh game loved by all, Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. Other games that are fancied by 3 out of 4 books are Contra 3 The Alien Wars, Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie Kong Double Trouble, Earthworm Jim, Final Fantasy 2/4, Final Fantasy 3/6, F-Zero, Mega Man X, Mortal Kombat 2, Secret of Mana, SimCity, Star Fox, Super Ghouls and Ghosts, Super Mario All-Stars, and Super Mario Kart. 15 of the games I just mentioned are among the 21 games in the Super NES Classic Edition, so even if not a total consensus, there is a lot of agreement on this handful of games as being the best of what the Super NES offers. Kind of surprised that Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Conquest, and Super Mario RPG, Legend of the Seven Stars, weren't loved by all, in the sense that both the SNES Omnibus and Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library didn't write more about them. Also lacking here, in my opinion, are Super Bomberman and any version of Street Fighter 2, but Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library doesn't feel that way about any multiplayer games, except Super Mario World, which barely counts since it's just alternating multiplayer, not simultaneous multiplayer. But it is the most picky anyway, with only 11 games deserving of a whole page. Out of those games, I've already mentioned them as being loved by either all books or 3 out of 4, except for ActRaiser, an amazing game that I'm surprised that the way overly generous the complete SNES Pocket Edition didn't recognize with a heart. How could there be 171 games or more that are better than ActRaiser? Maybe they don't like God Sims, but maybe no one likes Evolution because none of these books recognize EVO, Search for Eden, as anything special, which seems wrong somehow. The Super Nintendo Anthology must be written by Capcom fans, as it's the only book to favorite the first Final Fight and the 2 Breath of Fire games. And we could go on and on, analyzing and comparing their choices all day. Sure, we do enjoy seeing our own preferences confirmed to be popular and loved by others. Across these books, we get a sense of what those classic games might be. But as for any one individual book, you could get between 11 and 171 favorites. Ironically, I don't think it makes sense to recommend one book over another based on what they recommend, so this was just a hopefully fun and interesting comparison. But now you at least know that if you haven't played Super Mario World, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, Super Metroid, Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, and Super Castlevania 4, that you're missing out. Also, it might be amusing to look at more than one book anyway, since their individual ratings for games can vary, even those that are not favorites. It's interesting that you can have something like Best of the Best, which ironically gets a rare 0-star rating in the Super Nintendo Anthology, as if it should have been called Worst of the Worst, but it gets a 4.5 stars in Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library. So, getting multiple books doesn't necessarily mean there will be redundancy, but on that note, are they different in more than just opinion? To really stand out in this apparently now blooming crowd of 16-bit literature, each book offers something that the other books do not. With so much information, it's not surprising that these books can be massive tomes that might look great on a coffee table or shelf, but aren't practical to carry around. But the complete SNES Pocket Edition, as its name implies, can fit in a pocket. Well, a big pocket, or at least the glove compartment of your car. It may be lighter on content, but it seems designed for collectors to use when hunting down games or managing their collection. This is evident as the bottom of each page has checkboxes, including cart, box, and manual, though the full-size definitive edition has these too. The Pocket Edition adds boxes for played, beat, and rating, for gamers who actually want to play and review them all, and write in their own personal rating. For those that like an offline screenless option and don't mind marking up books, these checklists could be useful for collectors and completionists. While others are content with using box scans, Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library has realistic renders of game cartridges. This is visually striking, and it is obvious that a lot of work went into making all of these. Collectors of original carts will certainly appreciate this. Besides reviewing games in the software volume, the Super Nintendo Anthology also has the hardware volume, which gets deep into the Super NES's history and technology. The detail here is amazingly thorough, from all the insider info to the technical details and comparing the Super NES against several other consoles from the same era. Gaming historians and technical wizards would absolutely love this. The SNES Omnibus has notable quotables, which give another review of the game, and insider insights if you want to scoop from someone in the industry. Several games will feature multiple quotables and insights. This also features lots of printed material from the era, mostly magazine ads if you want a glimpse of the marketing at the time. If you are nostalgic for this era, including the hype around the games, you might find this interesting. The complete SNES Definitive Edition probably, and given its title, ironically, shines best in its Super Famicom section with 336 selected games, which make a better overview of that library as a whole than Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library's extremely short descriptions of its meager selection of 58 games. While the complete SNES doesn't attempt to have all the Japanese games, like the Super Nintendo Anthology's 981 entries, by not being obligated to talk about every Mahjong, Pachinko, and Shogi game, there was more room to display images at a comfortable size, such as the box art. It may only have one screenshot per game, and though that is often the case in the Super Nintendo Anthology, the screenshots here are large enough to see without a magnifying glass. Import gamers, and gamers with poor eyesight, from playing too many games naturally, will like this book. So you see, even if reviewing games are the intention of them all, there are differences in presentation and detail to make each one unique. I originally thought price would be a simple thing to compare, but it's really not. Firstly, the prices could have changed by the time you see this video, and sometimes there are sales or shortages. Please go to the official sites, links are in the description, to see what the current prices and availability are. Secondly, I'm actually quite leery about defining something's worth by its price tag. Thirdly, what about other fees? Considering that Geeks-Line Publishing, who did the Super Nintendo Anthology, is European, and all the other books are from America, then for me as a Canadian, I do have to pay exorbitant shipping and handling fees, and also sometimes customs fees, so often I pay around twice as much for a book than its listed price. I have seen the SNES Omnibus at local chapter stores, so I could have gone that route and saved on shipping. But as you can see from the autograph, I preferred getting these from Brett Weiss himself. Especially for all the others, I don't think they have massive print runs, meaning that their limited availability should be more of a deciding factor than their price, as it's easier to regret the money spent than a missed opportunity to own these books. Pat Contry's Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library also comes in a cheaper digital form, so that is less of a scarcity concern and might be an option for budget-conscious people. But I do think it's much better to have physical copies of these books. So, in short, use my reviews and pick whichever ones you like and just buy them. On that note, perhaps we should wrap up our findings with a summary of each book, so that you can figure out who to throw your money at. Let's review the original review scores. In my first looks at these books, I gave each of these books a score out of 5. The complete SNES Definitive Edition got a 3.5 out of 5. The SNES Omnibus got a 4 out of 5. The Super Nintendo Anthology got a 4 for the software volume and a 5 for the hardware volume, averaging 4.5 out of 5. Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library got a 5 out of 5. I didn't get around to reviewing the Pocket Edition of the complete SNES, but I will give it the same score as the Definitive Edition of 3.5. While there were improvements and corrections from the Definitive Edition, these were offset by the removal of all the non-American content, which is a shame since the Japanese Super Famicom section is actually pretty good. So in the end, the score is the same as the Definitive Edition. The existing scores are pretty spot on and don't require adjusting even after looking at all of them again. However, we can clarify this with a concluding statement about each book, as it's not necessarily as simple as that I think Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library is the best. I mean, sure, it's a super book, but each of the other books might actually be better for certain purposes. Besides having the best cover, overall presentation, and a lack of any major errors, at least as far as I can tell, Pat Contry's book Ultimate Nintendo Guide to the SNES Library has a great amount of coverage, with lots written for all of the American and European Super NES games. It only lacks when it comes to Japanese games. The title does say SNES to be fair, as in the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, not the Super Famicom, but since there is indeed a Super Famicom section, it feels like there could be more to it, as it's too big of a library to just be considered a side note. But otherwise, this is great all around. So if you do want Japanese coverage, you might consider Geeks-Line Publishing's The Super Nintendo Anthology, in which the software book tries to cover every game from every region, which sounds like a winning idea, except that many of the reviews for the games that are not considered the best or most popular get tiny reviews. Though it has the widest scope, thanks to the hardware book covering all the technical and historical stuff, which you don't get very much of at all in any of the other books. So if you want to know more about the Super NES than just games, that makes this a must-buy. But despite a section on advertisements from the era, if you really want to see that, you might want to look elsewhere, such as Brett Weiss's The SNES Omnibus. Many of the reviews here also feature the original magazine ads. The write-ups do get into specific game details at times, and the insider's insights and notable quotables add other perspectives, so this is not a bad choice if your focus is only American games, though this can be the most expensive option since you'll need both volumes. Though you might save on shipping if you don't buy it online, since in my experience, this seems to be the only one I've seen in an actual bookstore. Jeffrey Whitting Hagen's The Complete SNES Definitive Edition covers a little over a third of all Japanese games in addition to the American and European coverage. So it's not all of the Japanese games, but there's a good chance that the worthy ones are covered. You can actually see the box art in a decent size, so Super Famicom box art fans would appreciate this. This might be the best for the budget conscious, as it is the least expensive of the big books in physical form, and the Pocket Edition is even more affordable, with its pocket size making it handy if you like portable offline sources of info, as long as you're sticking to the Americas. So as you can see, it's not as easy as singling out any one book as supremely the best, and each book is unique enough that I can't really tell you to totally avoid any one either. If you want to know more about any of these books, be sure to check out the individual reviews I did of them earlier. Their links are in the description. So, that was the Super NES Encyclopedia Super Showdown. What do you think? Do you agree or disagree? Do you own any of these books, or will this help you decide which one, or which ones, you will get? And though I personally think the Super NES is the best video game console of all time, there's no denying the impact of its predecessor, the original Nintendo Entertainment System, which also has a number of encyclopedia-style books. If you would like me to review and then compare the 5 books that I currently know of that either already exist at the time of this video or are slated to come out soon, then be sure to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Every like, share, and subscription is incredibly appreciated, probably more than you know. And so if you indicate your support in any of these easy ways, it will ensure that I keep making these video book reviews. Thank you so much for watching this one, and if you made it this far, in the comments below, write down the name of your favorite Super NES game. So until the next video, keep reading those books and playing with power. See ya! No!